Is the act of interpreting art an act of betrayal? Can art ever be looked at and interpreted from a place that comes from no bias and is exactly what the artist wants you to interpret it as? Well, that opens up an entire philosophical can of worms. Obviously, art is subjective, and the subjectivity of it is what makes it art. It's the artistic conversation between artist and observer. In that moment in between, when the observer, even if that observer is the artist themselves, it is that moment that passes between the two that art is created. I'm not really going to talk about that. I just thought it'd be interesting to open this up with. All right, cheers. No, of course that's what we're talking about, but I'm going to take less of a philosophical standpoint and more of an archaeological standpoint when we're looking at this concept. So if you want a lot of philosophical discourse, the frescoes uncovered at the Palace of Minos on Crete have a bit of a tumultuous and somewhat controversial history. This is due to the archaeological negligence of one Arthur Evans. You know him, you love him, your whole idea of the past and history is constructed around their fallacies. It's 20th century archaeologists. So Evans was uncovering the Palace of Minos and he enlisted a friend of his, Émile Guilleron, to help him basically reconstruct the images of the frescoes that he found. But they were found in such fragmentary pieces that the reconstructions honestly become more of just original art. So does this make these frescoes real artifacts from the Minoans? Or just modern adaptations? And when does the fresco go from being a real archaeological artifact to an imagined one? It's getting fucking dark in here. What if I told you that prior to the 19th century, the Minoans didn't exist? In fact, there is no historical reference or allusion to this culture ever existing. Okay, that was a little bit clickbaity, but it's true. Arthur Evans took an immense interest in Crete, more specifically its historically rich city of Knossos, at which he began his now infamous excavations in 1900. The term Minoan to describe the ancient culture that Evans obsessed over was a modern appropriation of the mythological king Minos. And while Evans was not the first one to label the ancient civilization on Crete the Minoans, he was certainly the first one to claim that he had found this famed mythological palace of King Minos, the palace that held the famous labyrinth created by Daedalus to contain the Minotaur. It was very clear that Evans was convinced and obsessed and enamored with the idea of this pre-classical civilization that could act as a rival to the non-European societies of the Near East. He wanted this so much that he felt the need to exaggerate and sometimes even fabricate to the point where the Palace of Minos itself is not really an ancient ruin, but a modern one. Evans at the excavations enforced the unfinished look of the walls and roof lines in an attempt to invoke some sense of antiquity. And because of this, it's a site that really can only be viewed through the lens of 19th and 20th century sensibilities. And the parts of the palace that were restored from antiquity are still unfortunately quite unreliable depictions of Minoan culture. Evans restored the entire palace with like fragments of what he could find. He restored the entire palace on fragments, and he low-key just made up the rest. I would like to note that the throne room, the main attraction of the Minoan palace, was entirely fabricated by Evans. Like, he created it, he called it the throne room. It wasn't a throne room. We don't know what it was. And he passed it off as a fundamental aspect in understanding Minoan culture in terms of their iconography and architecture. Throughout his excavations, Evans was very obsessed with this idea of a dove goddess or a mother goddess, and making that a part of Minoan culture. This isn't entirely fabricated, like there are depictions of women who are potentially divine figures, but he was pushing this really hard. He created this idea of a mother goddess and tried to wedge it into every aspect of Minoan life. I love the archaeological discourse that Arthur Evans grew up without a mum, had serious mummy issues, and so when he found this culture and he found depictions of potentially divine female figures, he was like, guys, this is a matriarchal society that worships a mother goddess. Isn't that crazy? Some people argue, and I'm not going to, Evans either intentionally or not intentionally romanticized the past and created his own like matriarchal society. I'm not saying that happened, but that is a genuine theory. His devotion to this matriarchal Minoan culture also helped to distinguish the Minoans from ancient Oriental cultures known at the time, because he really wanted to solidify Knossos and Crete as the first European civilization. Awesome, Arthur. Good job. And thus the Minoans were formed. A culture almost entirely fabricated by some archaeologists in the 20th century. So given what we know about the liberties that Evans took when creating this culture, how can we possibly presume to view their art through a non-biased lens? The art of Knossos, created over 3,000 years ago, which was later reimagined by Evans, has now lost the chance to be ever viewed on its own. It has lost an imperative aspect of its artistic value. If the very culture through which we are to view this piece of art was manufactured by a British man in the 20th century, how are we ever able to comprehend its context to the level of interpreting its artist's artist's intent correctly. One example that I want to talk about is the fresco of the Ladies in Blue. This fresco was essentially almost entirely redesigned by Evans and his artist bestie, Émile Guéron. Frescoes have been one of the single most important artifacts in building this idea of what we now know as the Minoan culture. And they are beautiful and they do exist. He didn't create those from nothing. Throughout history, they've often been accredited for their sophistication compared to their artistic contemporaries, such as those in Western Asia and Egypt. It was the utmost desire of Evans to curate the idea of an exceeding culture, which was to be the foundation of Western civilization. And so his reconstructions took on a very modern aesthetic to fit the idea that, oh my God, look at this. This artifact from 3,000 years ago fits our aesthetics and our sensibilities so well, it must be the beginning of where Western civilization started. That's why Minoan frescoes of the 3rd millennium BC seem to fit so perfectly within the artistic movements of the Art Nouveau and Art Deco, which were really popular in Evans' lifetime. It's clear that looking at the Ladies in Blue, they hold a rather sophisticated modern disposition. Émile Guéron worked with very few fragmentary pieces of the original fresco to create an image of these matriarchal figures, often said to depict the goddesses that Evans was so crazy about. You can see in the picture how many fragments both Evans and Guéron had to work with and which parts of the fresco have been made up and created. Basically, what Guéron did was construct the appearance of these women from other fragmentary pieces that they found across the palace. And he later used facial features from other frescoes to put together their faces, of which the original faces have never been recovered. And neither have any fragments of their hair, which is interesting because this fresco has contributed so much to the historical conversation about Minoan fashion and hairstyles. But that was basically all made up by Guéron. And it's worth noting that the lack of fragments we even have for this particular fresco even puts into question if these were meant to be ladies at all, or if this was just Evans again wanting to create his mother goddess. After its reconstruction in the early 1900s, the fresco was damaged by an earthquake in 1926, and this led to Émile Guéron's son, also Émile Guéron, having to restore the fresco again. So now it's just an interpretation of an interpretation. This piece, although nowadays being almost synonymous with Minoan culture, is not an original and is barely even a restoration. This much was obvious to Evelyn Waugh after she went to visit the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion in 1929 and compared the Ladies in Blue to models on a modern cover of Vogue magazine, really airing lack of confidence in the restoration. So what? Where does this leave us in our talk about artistic interpretation and betrayal? Art is human nature. I don't think that's a necessarily hot take. I think lots of people believe that. We've been making art for as long as we've been humans. It's been argued that creating and consuming art is a definitive part of what makes us humans, what differentiates us from other animals. Every human society since before recorded history has felt the need to create art, what we call art. From cave paintings to great statues made of marble, and everything in between. Now, whether the person creating these things considered them artistic and a form of art is a whole other conversation. But in terms of how we view art today, it's clear that it's deeply rooted in our evolutionary past. One of the oldest examples as what we can define as art are the paintings in the Sulawesi cave. The art is a series of hand stencils which date back over 40,000 years ago. And situated in the modern context, we would consider this a form of art because it's an intentional sign of human presence and self-importance. However, no amount of research or analysis on this cave will allow us to comprehend the meaning behind it or its purpose, because that died with whoever created it. Did they think that when they were putting stencils of their hands on the wall that this was creating art? Did they want it to be interpreted artistically? Did art exist back then, or are we just calling it art because that's what we see it as now? In our modern culture, we're able to understand that art is a subjective and transient practice, and we should apply this to ancient cultures as well. Keeping this in mind is a really important archaeological practice, but it's so often overlooked and ignored. Many of the pieces of art that come from the broader archaeological record have been interpreted through the perspective of those who find them. It's like finders keepers. Whoever finds it gets to create the history around it. How can one adequately convey artistic expression if the very medium through which the art is being expressed is taken away? It's commonly said within literature and linguistics that the translator is the betrayer. For how can a language truly be transcended if it is structurally impossible to homogenize? Attempting to translate a phrase perfectly from one language into another is to betray either the writer or the reader or the language itself. The same can be said for art. Putting another person, the interpreter, in between the artistic conversation, artist to observer, is a betrayal of the artistic process. The inferences made on behalf of the artist detracts from our understanding of the culture the art is derived from. Whilst obviously the intention from archaeologists and historians and etc. is to interpret this art in order to create a better understanding of the culture that it comes from, I would argue that sometimes this does the complete opposite. It's clear that under the guise of interpretation and restoration, Evans created his own proto-Hellenic culture and fabricated not only their art but their livelihood and the way we view them for centuries to come. By doing so, Evans didn't give the artists who created the Minoan frescoes the chance to be understood, and he believed that his interpretation of them was the correct one. I would argue that if he had published the fragments in their fragmentary pieces and only put them together as much as was clear and didn't try to reconstruct everything around them, they could still be interpreted by us in a way that is somewhat more relevant. But now we will only ever see his interpretation because he found the palace and he got to decide what the frescoes were. And he took that away from the artists who created them because he believed in what he wanted to see. And now we all have to see that. Object authenticity is an integral part of the archaeological practice. It distinguishes an artifact from something that's original and something that's been reconstructed. An object becomes an artifact because of its age value, because we can date it to somewhere that we want to figure out about. Its age value is what makes it interesting to archaeologists, because it holds with it an understanding of a past culture. The age value of these Minoan frescoes now is negligible because they're reconstructions based off the imaginations of Evans and Guérin. It can be argued that they have their own age value now and are archaeologically relevant for the artistic tastes of the 20th century. However, I will not argue that. Evans believed the Minoans to be far more sophisticated than their contemporaries. He was going to do anything he could to prove that, ultimately betraying the artists and their art by taking away an integral aspect of the artistic conversation, denying not only others from appreciating the art in a way that might be more fulfilling, but also denying the artist of their artistic agency. I believe that the act of Arthur Evans' reconstructions at Knossos is an act of artistic betrayal. It's getting dark and cold, but please feel free to continue this conversation. Anyway, I'm gonna go. Bye-bye.